The satellite feed went dark at 3:47 hours, leaving the Pentagon war room in sterile silence. 12 Navy SEALs were trapped behind enemy lines in the Helmand province, their extraction helicopter a twisted monument of metal and flame in the Afghan desert. The mission commander's voice crackled through the static. All assets, stand down. Repeat, all assets stand down. But in the pre-dawn darkness, 30,000 feet above the Hindu Kush, Captain Valentina Ghost Kozlova wasn't listening to orders anymore. The FA-18E Super Hornet cut through the thin mountain air like a blade through silk, its twin General Electric engines humming a death song that only she could hear. Ghost's gloved fingers traced the throttle with surgical precision, her breathing steady despite the chaos erupting in her headset. Command had written off Bravo Team as casualties, acceptable losses in the grand calculus of war. But Ghost had spent 2 tours in Iraq watching good soldiers die because someone in a clean uniform decided their lives weren't worth the risk. The radio crackled again. Viper 27, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge. Ghost's jaw tightened beneath her oxygen mask. Viper 27, they still used her training call sign, the one that reminded everyone she was an outsider in their boys' club. They'd never called her Ghost, not officially. That name belonged to the shadows where she'd earned her reputation, pulling Marines out of impossible situations when everyone else had given up. Below, the terrain unfolded like a moonscape of death. The SEALs were pinned in a valley that maps called Paradise Ridge, though there was nothing heavenly about the Taliban positions carved into the surrounding cliffs. Ghost's targeting system painted the enemy in glowing red, dozens of heat signatures converging on 12 rapidly cooling blue dots. Her fuel gauge showed 27 minutes of flight time remaining, enough for 1 pass, maybe 2, if she pushed the engines beyond their safety margins. Ghost, this is Reaper Control. Your presence is not authorized in this airspace. The new voice belonged to Colonel Marcus Hendricks, a man who'd made his career questioning her every decision. Return to base or face court-martial proceedings. She switched off her radio and banked hard toward the valley floor. In the distance, muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Somewhere in that hellscape, Staff Sergeant Tommy Reeves was probably wondering if anyone remembered his daughter's birthday was next week. Ghost remembered everything about the men she flew for, their fears, their families, their final words when the chips were down. The Super Hornet's heads-up display painted targeting solutions across her visor, but Ghost was already calculating something else entirely. How to save 12 lives with a woman's touch in a man's war, one impossible mission at a time. Command had written them off. She was about to prove Command wrong. Ghost's childhood had been forged in the shadow of the Ural Mountains, where her grandmother Katia would point to the evening sky and tell stories of Soviet female pilots who fought the Nazis. The night witches, she'd whisper, flew in darkness when men said it was impossible. Valentina Kozlova had immigrated to America at age 7, carrying those stories like sacred flames in her heart. Now, at 34, she commanded one of the most lethal aircraft ever built, though few in the Navy took her seriously. The mockery had started at flight school. Kozlova became Cold Shoulder, then simply Ice Queen. Her instructors praised her technical skills while questioning her killer instinct. During carrier qualifications, a fellow pilot had joked that she flew like she was afraid to break a nail. Ghost had responded by landing her F-14 Tomcat in weather conditions that grounded every other aviator on deck. The transformation began in Iraq during Operation Phantom Fury in Fallujah. A Marine patrol had radioed for close air support while trapped in a building surrounded by insurgents. The on-scene commander, a Marine captain named Jake Morrison, had been skeptical when he heard a woman's voice answer his call for help. "Can you handle this, sweetie?" he'd asked over the radio, his tone dripping with condescension. Ghost's response had been delivered through a precisely placed 500-pound bomb that eliminated 6 enemy positions without touching the Marines' building. When Morrison's team emerged 20 minutes later, he keyed his radio with newfound respect. "Unknown female aviator, you just saved 12 Marines. What's your call sign?" She'd answered simply. "Ghost." The name stuck. Now, approaching Paradise Ridge, Ghost could feel the weight of that legacy pressing against her chest. Her HUD showed multiple surface-to-air missile sites scattered across the valley floor, their radar signatures painting ominous triangles on her display. This wasn't a surgical strike. It was a death trap designed to lure American aircraft into a killing field. The SEAL's last transmission had been fragmentary, taking heavy fire from all sides. "Kowalski is down. Need immediate extraction." Then silence. Ghost's tactical display showed their heat signatures clustered behind a low ridge, approximately 800 meters from the burning wreckage of their helicopter. They'd managed to reach partial cover, but Taliban forces were closing in from 3 directions. Ghost rolled her aircraft inverted and began a steep dive toward the valley floor. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. At this angle and speed, she had perhaps 90 seconds before she'd need to pull up or become a crater in the Afghan landscape. Her targeting computer began acquiring locks on the enemy positions, but something felt wrong about the whole setup. The Taliban weren't usually this organized, this tactically sophisticated. Someone had orchestrated this ambush with military precision, using the helicopter extraction as bait to draw American forces into a predetermined kill zone. Ghost's trained eye picked up the subtle signs, the too-perfect positioning of the anti-aircraft sights, the coordinated movement patterns of the ground forces, the communication equipment that seemed far too advanced for typical insurgent operations. At 5,000 feet, her radar warning receiver screamed to life. The first surface-to-air missile launched from the western ridge, a Soviet-era SA-7 that painted a smoking arc across the dawn sky. Ghost jinked hard left, deploying chaff and flares while simultaneously acquiring a targeting solution on the launch site. Her 20mm cannon spoke with mechanical precision, walking a line of destruction across the enemy position. But the SA-7 had been a distraction. The real threat came from the north, a Chinese-made FN-6 shoulder-fired missile with an infrared seeker that ignored her countermeasures. Ghost pulled 7GS in a climbing turn that pressed her body deep into her ejection seat, her vision tunneling as blood drained from her brain. The missile passed within 50 feet of her starboard engine intake before detonating harmlessly against a cliff face. "Jesus," she breathed, leveling off at 12,000 feet. Her hands were steady on the controls, but sweat had pooled in her flight gloves. This wasn't random Taliban harassment. This was a sophisticated air defense network designed to kill American pilots. The radio crackled back to life. She'd forgotten to turn it off during her dive. "Viper 27, this is Reaper Control. You are in violation of direct orders. Abort your mission immediately or face the consequences." Ghost keyed her microphone with a calm that surprised her. "Reaper Control, Ghost. 12 American servicemen are about to die. I suggest you find a different frequency to hassle pilots who actually give a damn about orders." She switched off the radio again and banked toward the SEAL's position. Below, muzzle flashes continued to light up the darkness. Time was running out, and she was the only thing standing between those men and a very bad day. Her tactical computer updated with new intelligence. The SEALs weren't just trapped. They were bait in a larger trap designed to kill American aviators. Ghost smiled grimly behind her oxygen mask. If someone wanted to hunt American pilots, they'd pick the wrong woman to start with. The second attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of months of planning and professional military training. 3 SA-14 missiles launched from concealed positions, their exhaust trails creating a deadly constellation against the morning sky. Ghost's aircraft system screamed warnings as she dove toward the valley floor, pulling evasive maneuvers that pushed both her and the Super Hornet to their physical limits. The first missile exploded harmlessly above her, fooled by a combination of chaff and electronic countermeasures. The second passed close enough to her port wing that she felt the concussion through the airframe. But the third missile, launched from a position she hadn't seen, tracked true despite her desperate maneuvering. Ghost felt the impact before she heard it, a metallic crack that ran through the aircraft like breaking bones. Her port engine immediately began showing warning lights as shrapnel peppered the intake. Engine temperature spiked into the red zone, and hydraulic pressure dropped precipitously. The Super Hornet, moments before a perfectly balanced killing machine, suddenly felt heavy and unresponsive in her hands. "Mayday, mayday," she called automatically, then remembered her radio was off. No one was listening anyway. Command had written off the SEALs. They'd certainly written off one disobedient female pilot. Ghost switched to internal power and began running emergency procedures from memory, her training taking over despite the chaos erupting around her. The port engine flamed out at 8,000 feet. Ghost secured the fuel flow and adjusted her flight profile to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. The Super Hornet could fly on one engine, but not for long, and certainly not while conducting close air support in a hot landing zone. She had perhaps 10 minutes before she'd need to either reach friendly airspace or punch out over hostile territory. Below, the SEAL's position was being overrun. Her infrared targeting pod showed Taliban forces advancing from two directions, with the Americans' defensive perimeter shrinking by the minute. Ghost could see individual heat signatures moving among the rocks, some crawling, others lying motionless in positions that suggested they weren't moving again. She armed her remaining ordnance and began a shallow dive toward the enemy positions. The damaged engine made her approach unstable, forcing her to correct constantly for yaw and altitude deviations. But her grandmother's stories echoed in her memory, Soviet women pilots flying damaged aircraft through impossible odds, saving their comrades through skill and determination that male pilots claimed they didn't possess. Ghost's first strafing run eliminated a machine gun position that had been raking the SEAL's cover with deadly accuracy. Her cannon fire was precise despite the aircraft's instability, walking destruction across enemy positions with surgical precision. The Taliban forces scattered, seeking cover among the rocks, but Ghost was already lining up for a second pass. The damaged engine began vibrating violently as she pulled out of her dive. Hydraulic fluid streamed from punctured lines, creating a rainbow mist in the thin mountain air. Her flight controls felt increasingly sluggish, requiring more effort to maintain level flight. The Super Hornet was dying beneath her, but it wasn't dead yet. Neither was Ghost. Staff Sergeant Tommy Reeves pressed his back against the cold rock and tried to ignore the pain in his left shoulder, where Taliban shrapnel had found its mark. Around him, the remnants of Bravo Team maintained a defensive perimeter that was shrinking with each passing minute. They'd lost Kowalski in the initial ambush, and Martinez had been unconscious since a mortar fragment opened a gash across his forehead. "Contact left," Corpsman Danny Kim shouted, triggering a burst from his M4 carbine. The muzzle flash illuminated his young face, 22 years old and already looking like he'd aged a decade in the past 6 hours. Two more Taliban fighters dropped, but Reeves could see dozens more moving through the rocks. They were being systematically surrounded, cut off from any possible escape route. The radio crackled with static. Their communications had been spotty since the helicopter crash, with most military frequencies jammed by sophisticated electronic warfare equipment that shouldn't have existed in Taliban hands. But through the static, Reeves heard something impossible, a woman's voice, calm and professional, calling for their position. "Bravo Team, this is Ghost. I'm flying close air support. Can you mark your position with IR strobes?" Reeves keyed his microphone. "Ghost, Bravo Team leader. We're pinned down at grid reference." He rattled off their coordinates while simultaneously wondering if fatigue was making him hallucinate female pilots. In 12 years of Marine Corps service, He'd never heard a woman's voice providing close air support. "Copy, Bravo team, I see you. Keep your heads down, danger close." The first strafing run came like thunder from a clear sky. 20-millimeter cannon shells walked a line of destruction 30 meters from their position, eliminating a Taliban machine gun crew that had been preparing to assault their perimeter. The precision was surgical, deadly accurate despite the impossible geometry of the mountain terrain. "Holy shit," breathed Private First Class Rodriguez, the youngest member of the team. "She's actually doing it." Reeves found himself grinning despite their desperate situation. Whoever this ghost was, she flew like nothing he'd ever seen. The follow-up attack eliminated 2 more enemy positions, buying them precious breathing room. But he could hear something wrong in the sound of her aircraft. One engine was running rough, and the second pass had been noticeably less stable than the first. "Ghost Bravo team leader, your bird sounds hurt. What's your status?" The response came after a pause that lasted too long. "Bravo team, Ghost, I'm fully mission capable, continuing close air support." But Reeves had been around military aviators long enough to recognize the careful phrasing. She was lying, and they both knew it. The Taliban forces regrouped faster than expected, moving with tactical discipline that confirmed Reeves' suspicions about their training and equipment. These weren't typical insurgents. They were professional soldiers, possibly Pakistani special forces or foreign fighters with advanced military training. Their positioning and communication suggested months of preparation for exactly this type of engagement. Another strafing run bought them time, but Reeves could see the enemy adapting their tactics. They were using the terrain more effectively, advancing under cover in coordinated bounds that would eventually overwhelm the SEAL's position. Ghost's aircraft was clearly damaged, with hydraulic fluid streaming from punctured lines and one engine producing intermittent flames. "Ghost, be advised you're leaking fluids. Recommend you return to base for emergency landing." Her response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Negative, Bravo team. I'm staying until you're clear." Reeves felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the kind of courage he'd only seen in the best Marines. This woman, whoever she was, had chosen to risk her life for 12 men she'd never met, flying a damaged aircraft in impossible conditions because it was the right thing to do. Around him, his men had stopped making jokes about female pilots. They were watching the sky with newfound respect, waiting for their guardian angel to make the next pass. The Taliban had brought friends. Ghost's damaged radar picked up new contacts approaching from the south, 2 helicopters flying low and fast through the mountain valleys. Her identification systems couldn't get a solid lock, but their flight profiles suggested military training and hostile intent. The trap was closing from multiple directions, designed to eliminate both the ground team and any aircraft providing support. Ghost's fuel gauge showed 12 minutes of flight time remaining. Her port engine was now producing more smoke than thrust, and hydraulic pressure had dropped to critical levels. The Super Hornet felt increasingly unresponsive, requiring constant corrections to maintain altitude and heading. She should have punched out 10 minutes ago and let the aircraft crash into the mountains. Instead, she armed her last 2 Maverick missiles and began calculating firing solutions. The approaching helicopters were flying in tactical formation, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Ghost's targeting computer identified them as likely MiL-Me-24 Heinz Soviet-era gunships with enough firepower to annihilate the SEAL's position. Their presence confirmed her suspicions about foreign involvement in the ambush. "Bravo team, Ghost. You've got 2 helicopters inbound from the south. I'm going to engage, but you need to be ready to move when I give the word." Reeves' voice came back steady and professional. "Copy, Ghost. We'll be ready." The first Maverick missile launched with a solid thump that she felt through the airframe. Its infrared seeker acquired the lead helicopter and guided the weapon through a perfect intercept course. The explosion lit up the valley like a miniature sunrise, sending burning debris cascading into the rocks below. The second helicopter immediately began evasive maneuvering, but Ghost was already repositioning for her final attack. The damaged engine chose that moment to catastrophically fail, sending chunks of turbine blade through the port wing and causing immediate fuel loss. The Super Hornet rolled hard left, nearly inverting before Ghost regained control. Her last Maverick missile flew true, striking the second helicopter as it attempted to climb out of the valley. The explosion was smaller this time. The warhead had only partially detonated, but it was enough to send the Hind spinning into the mountainside. Ghost's aircraft was now running on fumes and borrowed time. The starboard engine was producing maximum thrust, but she could feel it beginning to overheat under the increased load. Multiple warning lights painted her cockpit in shades of red and amber, each one representing a system failure that should have forced an immediate ejection. Bravo team, this is Ghost. Helicopters are down. What's your status? Ghost, the bad guys are pulling back. You bought us some time, but we're still trapped. Our helicopter is toast, and we've got wounded who can't walk out. Ghost's tactical display showed friendly forces approaching from the east, a Marine Corps rescue package that would arrive in approximately 20 minutes. But the SEALs needed immediate extraction, and her aircraft wouldn't last another 10 minutes. She made a decision that would have horrified her flight instructors. Bravo team, I'm going to attempt a combat landing on the ridge above your position. It's going to be ugly, but my bird might provide cover until the cavalry arrives. The silence on the radio stretched too long. Finally, Reeves' voice came back, quiet but firm. Ghost, that's a suicide run. The terrain is too rough for a landing. Ghost smiled behind her oxygen mask. Sergeant, I'm a woman flying in the United States Navy. I've been making impossible landings my entire career. She began her final approach to Paradise Ridge, calculating glide slopes and landing distances with the precision that had kept her alive through 2 combat tours. The mathematics were unforgiving. She had one chance to get it right. Below, 12 American servicemen waited for a miracle delivered on damaged wings by a pilot they'd never learned to respect until it was almost too late. The ridge was 800 meters long and perhaps 50 meters wide, littered with rocks and scarred by decades of erosion. In daylight, with a fully functional aircraft, it would have been a challenging landing. At dawn, in a damaged Super Hornet running on one engine and emergency hydraulics, it was technically impossible. Ghost began her approach at 200 feet, configuring the aircraft for landing while simultaneously calculating the precise angle needed to clear the rocks at the ridge's eastern end. Her landing gear came down with a grinding sound that suggested significant battle damage, and her flaps extended asymmetrically due to hydraulic failures. The Super Hornet felt heavy and unbalanced, fighting her inputs like a wounded animal. At 100 feet, her radar altimeter began screaming warnings. The ridge was rising faster than her approach profile indicated, forcing her to add power from her remaining engine. The additional thrust created more heat than the damaged cooling systems could handle, but she held the throttle setting steady. There would be time to worry about engine failure after she was on the ground. 50 feet. The rocks below looked sharp enough to shred aircraft aluminum, and her approach speed was at least 20 knots too fast for the available runway length. Ghost cut power and pulled back on the stick, trading airspeed for altitude in a controlled stall that would either save her life or kill her in the next 10 seconds. The Super Hornet's main landing gear touched down with an impact that rattled every rivet in the airframe. Ghost immediately applied maximum braking and deployed her drag chute, feeling the aircraft shimmy and slide across the uneven surface. Rocks sparked against the landing gear, and she could hear metal tearing as the rough terrain claimed pieces of her aircraft. Halfway down the ridge, her nose gear collapsed. The Super Hornet pitched forward, sliding on its belly in a shower of sparks and grinding metal. Ghost fought to keep the aircraft centered on the narrow ridge, while debris from her aircraft cascaded into the valley below. The starboard engine finally seized completely, its death throes marked by a plume of black smoke and several small explosions. The aircraft came to rest less than 50 meters from the ridge's western edge, nose down, and listing slightly to port. Ghost ran through her emergency shutdown procedures with methodical precision, securing fuel lines and arming systems before the inevitable fire reached something explosive. Her hands were steady despite everything that had just happened. 12 years of naval aviation training had prepared her for moments exactly like this. She popped her canopy and climbed out of the cockpit, immediately drawing her sidearm and scanning for threats. The valley below was eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of burning helicopters marking the recent battle. The SEAL's position was visible 300 meters down the slope, marked by occasional muzzle flashes as they maintained their defensive perimeter. Ghost keyed her survival radio. "Bravo team, Ghost, I'm on the ridge above your position. My aircraft is down but intact. How copy?" Reeves' voice came back immediately, colored with disbelief and admiration. "Ghost, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen. Are you injured?" Ghost performed a quick self-assessment. Her left shoulder ached from the landing impact, and she'd bitten her tongue hard enough to draw blood, but nothing seemed broken. "Negative, Bravo team. I'm mission capable. What's your tactical situation?" "The enemy forces are regrouping about 600 meters to the west. They've stopped their assault, probably trying to figure out what the hell just happened. Our wounded are stable, but Rodriguez took another hit during the last attack." Ghost began working her way down the rocky slope toward the SEAL's position, using the terrain for cover while maintaining communication. Her survival kit contained enough ammunition and medical supplies to make a difference, but more importantly, her aircraft's position on the ridge provided both observation and potential cover for the team. 20 minutes later, she slid into the rocky outcrop where Bravo team had established their defensive position. 12 pairs of eyes stared at her with an expression she'd never seen before, complete, unqualified respect from men who had watched her risk everything to save their lives. Staff Sergeant Reeves extended his hand. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you." Ghost shook his hand firmly. "Sergeant, you can thank me by staying alive until the Marines get here." She'd finally found her place in the Brotherhood of Combat Arms, not as a woman trying to prove herself in a man's world, but as a warrior who had earned her place through skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to leave no one behind. The counterattack came at sunrise, a coordinated assault that demonstrated the enemy's professional military training and sophisticated equipment. Ghost counted at least 40 Taliban fighters moving through the rocks below, supported by crew-served weapons and communication equipment that allowed precise coordination between multiple elements. From their position behind the rocky outcrop, the 13 Americans, 12 SEALs, and one very determined pilot maintained a defensive perimeter that was being tested from multiple directions. Ghost had positioned herself with Corpsman Kim and the wounded, providing security while monitoring radio communications for signs of the approaching Marine rescue force. "Contact front," Rodriguez called out, his voice steady despite the fresh bandage covering a shrapnel wound on his forearm. His M4 carbine spoke in controlled bursts, each shot carefully aimed at specific targets rather than fired in panic. The young Marine had grown up considerably in the past few hours. Ghost keyed her survival radio. "Reaper control, Ghost. I'm on the ground with Bravo team providing defensive support. Request immediate update on rescue package status." The response came from a different voice, Colonel Hendricks himself, apparently monitoring the frequency. "Ghost, your court-martial proceedings have been suspended pending successful completion of this unauthorized mission. Marine rescue package is inbound. ETA 15 minutes. She almost smiled. Even facing potential court-martial, Hendricks couldn't resist the passive-aggressive reminder that she disobeyed direct orders, but his tone carried something else, a grudging acknowledgement that her actions had prevented a massacre. The Taliban forces had learned from their earlier failures. Instead of direct assault, they were using suppressive fire to pin down the Americans while small teams maneuvered for flanking attacks. Ghost could see the tactical elegance of their approach, classic military doctrine executed by fighters with formal training, rather than typical insurgent tactics. "Sergeant Reeves," she called, "they're trying to get above us on the North Ridge. If they establish a position there, we're in trouble." Reeves nodded grimly. He'd identified the same threat, but lacked the manpower to address it while maintaining their current defensive positions. "Can you and Kim hold this position while we shift fire to the north?" Ghost checked her ammunition. 3 magazines for her sidearm and a M4 carbine she'd appropriated from the helicopter wreckage. Not much for a prolonged firefight, but enough to make a difference. "Roger, go." 4 SEALs shifted their fire to the northern approach, while Ghost and Kim maintained security for the wounded. The tactical adjustment was seamless, demonstrating the kind of unit cohesion that came from extensive training and shared combat experience. Ghost found herself integrated into their defense as naturally as if she'd been part of the team from the beginning. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the valley walls, multiple aircraft approaching from the east. Ghost's heart leaped until she realized the sound was wrong. These weren't Marine Corps helicopters. They were smaller, faster, and flying in tactical formation that suggested hostile intent. "Bravo team, those are not our birds," she called out. "Everyone take cover." 2 attack helicopters crested the eastern ridge, their nose-mounted cannons already seeking targets among the rocks. Ghost recognized them as Me-35s, export versions of the Hind gunship with upgraded avionics and weapon systems. Their presence confirmed foreign government involvement in the ambush. These aircraft required sophisticated maintenance and trained crews that exceeded typical insurgent capabilities. The first helicopter began its attack run, 13 cannon shells impacting around their position with devastating accuracy. Rock fragments and metal splinters filled the air as the Americans pressed themselves deeper into whatever cover they could find. Ghost felt the familiar clarity that came with imminent death. Time slowed, her vision sharpened, and every detail of their tactical situation became crystal clear. Her damaged Super Hornet sat on the ridge above them. Nose gear collapsed, but weapons systems potentially still functional. If she could reach the aircraft and restore power to the targeting systems. "Cover me," she told Kim, then began sprinting up the rocky slope toward her aircraft. Ghost reached her aircraft as the second helicopter began its attack run, 13 shells impacting dangerously close to her position. She vaulted into the cockpit and began emergency restart procedures, praying that the backup electrical systems had survived the hard landing. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, but the targeting computer flickered to life. Her remaining ammunition consisted of 150 rounds of 20 cannon shells and 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles that had somehow survived the landing. The aircraft couldn't fly, but its weapon systems were still functional if she could manually orient them toward the approaching helicopters. The Super Hornet's radar locked onto the lead helicopter as it completed its turn for another attack run. Ghost's finger found the missile release button, calculating intercept angles and probabilities with the cold precision that had kept her alive through 2 combat tours. The Sidewinder missile launched with a satisfying roar, its infrared seeker immediately acquiring the helicopter's hot exhaust signature. The explosion lit up the dawn sky as the missile found its target, sending burning debris cascading into the valley below. The second helicopter immediately broke off its attack, climbing rapidly while deploying flares and chaff. But Ghost was already tracking its movement, leading the target like a hunter following a wounded deer. Her second Sidewinder missile flew true, striking the helicopter as it attempted to escape over the northern ridge. The fireball was visible for miles, marking the end of the most sophisticated air defense network the Taliban had ever assembled in Afghanistan. Ghost keyed her radio as Marine Corps helicopters finally appeared on the eastern horizon. Bravo Team Ghost, threat eliminated, cavalry's arriving. From their position below, she could hear the SEALs cheering. 12 men who had watched a woman destroy 2 attack helicopters from a disabled aircraft, using nothing but skill, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Staff Sergeant Reeves' voice came over the radio, quiet but filled with something that sounded like awe. "Ghost, I don't know what they taught you in flight school, but remind me never to piss off a female pilot." Ghost smiled as she climbed out of her aircraft for the final time. "Sergeant, they taught me that when American servicemen are in trouble, you do whatever it takes to bring them home." The Marine Corps rescue package consisted of 4 CH-53E Super Stallion helicopters escorted by 2 AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters, a formation that represented overwhelming firepower and the institutional commitment to leave no one behind. Ghost watched them approach with mixed emotions, relief that the SEALs would receive proper medical attention, but also sadness that her time with Bravo Team was ending. The lead Super Stallion touched down in the valley below, its rotor wash creating a dust storm that provided concealment for the extraction operation. Marines poured from the aircraft, immediately establishing a security perimeter while corpsmen tended to the wounded SEALs. The entire operation was executed with textbook precision, demonstrating the kind of institutional competence that made the United States military the most capable force in history. Ghost supervised the evacuation of her aircraft's sensitive equipment, ensuring that classified systems were either removed or destroyed before abandoning the Super Hornet. The fighter would remain on Paradise Ridge as a monument to impossible odds and stubborn determination, too damaged for recovery, but too symbolic to forget. "Ma'am, we need to get you on the bird," called a young Marine sergeant, gesturing toward one of the waiting helicopters. "Colonel's orders, you're flying back to Bagram with the wounded." Ghost nodded, taking one final look at the battlefield where she'd proven something important to herself and others. The Taliban forces had melted away into the mountains, leaving behind only the smoking wreckage of their ambush and the knowledge that American military aviation had produced something they couldn't defeat or understand. Staff Sergeant Reeves appeared at her shoulder, moving slowly due to his wounded arm but insisting on walking to the helicopter under his own power. "Ghost, I wanted to thank you before we get back to the world. What you did up there, that wasn't just good flying. That was something else entirely." She studied his face, seeing genuine respect in his eyes rather than the condescending tolerance she'd grown accustomed to from male servicemen. "Sergeant, I just did my job." "No, ma'am, you did a lot more than that. You saved 12 lives by ignoring orders and risking your own life in a damaged aircraft. That's not duty, that's heroism." Ghost felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that the mockery and skepticism she'd endured throughout her career had finally given way to something more valuable. Acceptance based on demonstrated competence rather than gender-based assumptions. The helicopter ride back to Bagram Air Base passed in relative silence, with the SEALs receiving medical attention while Ghost stared out at the Afghan landscape scrolling past below. She was already composing her after-action report, documenting the tactical lessons learned and the intelligence indicators that had revealed foreign involvement in the ambush. But mostly, she was thinking about her grandmother's stories of the night witches, Soviet women pilots who had earned their place in military history through skill and courage, rather than political correctness or gender equality initiatives. Ghost had finally joined their ranks, not as a symbol or a statement, but as a warrior who had proven her worth in the crucible of combat. The formal debriefing would come later, along with the inevitable questions about her decision to ignore direct orders. But those bureaucratic concerns felt distant and unimportant compared to the simple satisfaction of knowing that 12 American servicemen were alive, because she had chosen courage over compliance. As the helicopter approached Bagram, Ghost could see news crews already positioning themselves near the landing zone. Someone had leaked the story, turning her unauthorized mission into a media event that would inevitably become entangled with larger political narratives about women in combat roles. She sighed and checked her equipment one final time, preparing to face a different kind of battlefield, one where her actions would be dissected by people who had never faced life-or-death decisions in hostile airspace. The congressional hearing room buzzed with anticipation as Ghost entered in her dress blue uniform, ribbons and insignia marking a career that had suddenly become the subject of national attention. 3 weeks had passed since Paradise Ridge, 3 weeks of media interviews, Pentagon briefings, and legal consultations that had transformed her from an unknown naval aviator into a reluctant symbol of military evolution. Representative Sarah Martinez, chairwoman of the House Armed Services Committee, called the hearing to order. Captain Kozlova, thank you for appearing before this committee. Your actions in Afghanistan have raised important questions about military discipline, command authority, and the role of women in combat operations. Ghost had prepared for this moment, working with Navy lawyers to craft responses that would satisfy congressional curiosity without compromising operational security or her fellow service members. But sitting in the witness chair, facing cameras and politicians, she felt more nervous than she had flying through Taliban missile fire. Madam Chairwoman, I'm honored to appear before this committee and answer any questions about my service. The questions began predictably, focusing on her decision to ignore direct orders and conduct an unauthorized combat mission. Ghost answered each one carefully, explaining her reasoning without criticizing the chain of command or suggesting that disobedience was acceptable military conduct. Captain Kozlova, asked Representative James Crawford, a former Marine colonel, you've been portrayed in the media as a hero who saved American lives, but you also directly violated orders from superior officers. How do you reconcile those two facts? Ghost had anticipated this question. Sir, I violated orders because I believed American servicemen were in imminent danger of death or capture. In that situation, I felt my duty to protect fellow Americans superseded my obligation to follow orders that would have resulted in their deaths. Are you suggesting that military officers should ignore orders whenever they personally disagree with command decisions? No, sir, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that there are rare circumstances where moral imperatives override regulatory compliance. The 12 members of Bravo team are alive today because I made that choice. Representative Martinez leaned forward. Captain, your actions have been praised by some as exemplifying the best traditions.